Okay, guys, welcome back. So today we're going to be looking at Neoclassicism. I actually quite like Neoclassicism, more so than Rococo, but of course you don't have to. I mean, you are welcome to disagree with me on points of taste and whatnot. Obviously, this course is mostly me giving you the information, the facts about the art that we're looking at, but yeah. Okay, but this is kind of the art for the Age of the Enlightenment, as it says up there anyway. So that's mostly 1750 to about 1800. Just a little bit of overlap, but yeah, that's pretty much the prime era for it. The theme is return to reason. So Rococo art kind of lacks that for the most part. It's mostly emotional. It's mostly for an aristocratic taste. Not really relatable for most people in most of what we're finding. But in this period, we're going to be looking, well, it's going to be coinciding with the Enlightenment, so it's going to be pure reason is the idea for the Enlightenment, logic and virtue. So modern science kind of emerges based on empiricism. Um, so we're going to start. Empiricism is just what you can see, like with your senses and whatnot, empirical data, um, but also logic, morality. So we're interested in. So we're going to try to be a more moral and just society. This is the era of the American Revolution. These lots of the thinkers of the Enlightenment are going to be very influential for the founding of the nation. Um, so it's a pretty big deal as far as American history is concerned. And this is the era of Neoclassicism, so we get neoclassical structures for most of our government buildings, and that's been reiterated. Like they've been imitated even beyond that point. Of course, lots of U.S. Capitol buildings look a lot like the state Capitol building and whatnot. Even if they weren't built but maybe 100 years ago or some more recently. Okay. So during the Enlightenment, we get two types of revolutions. We get Industrial Revolution, begins in Britain about 1760. It takes a little bit longer to get to the United States. The United States is a bit more spread out, a bit more sparsely populated, but eventually it'll get here, and that's when we start to see more of an urbanization a bit later. But during this period, it's starting in Britain. And then we get the political revolutions, first with the U.S. and then a little bit later with France, Napoleon Bonaparte in 1789. So these are definitely times of transition. We get lots of shifts from aristocracy to these democratic forms of government, like republic, which is what the U.S. government is modeled off of the Roman Republic, and then with elements of the Athenian democracy in there. And this again in urbanization, so from rural life to urban life, and then a shift from agricultural to industrial stuff. And this is, we're in a post-industrial world. We're not really in America. Most of the industry has moved overseas, and we are, most of our jobs are not agricultural or industrial. They're tertiary, more service, stuff like that, intellectual things, whatever. But okay, but some of the key figures during this era, we get John Locke. So human rights are, we are born good, and there are certain rights that you have regardless, just by virtue of being human, like life, liberty, pursuit, happiness. That's, you can kind of get that idea. We're getting it a lot from him. John Locke is very important to founding fathers. Isaac Newton with our birth of modern science based on observation, so empiricism. Voltaire, he's French, doctrine of progress, so progress through science and knowledge, and that's good. Progress is good. And then Rousseau, he's super famous, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's the guy that came up with the noble savage, but return to nature and innocence, so the noble savage again. And then Diderot, the world's first encyclopedia was actually published by him, so it kind of categorized that knowledge. Modern philosophy essentially begins with John Locke, where he refutes the idea of original sin, that all humans are born good, and that we have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. So the government, our government changed that a little bit to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But so you can see where we're definitely looking at John Locke. And the government's function is simply to protect those rights. And that's what the American government is modeled off initially. Times have changed. But and then Isaac Newton, again, modern science based on empiricism. So and that like Newton doesn't really get into the philosophy himself so much, but it is pretty influential for other philosophers, definitely. Especially with like Rousseau's that return to nature, innocence, and whatnot. Like there's a sense of natural progression, which in many regards might be seen as, goodness, I don't know. The modern political landscape is a nightmare, but the like racist or something like that. But he's not really wrong in the sense that societies progress. We go from Stone Age, we go to the Bronze Age, we go to the Iron Age, and some of them took longer than others to get there. But that essentially the further you get along that line of progress, the more immoral you tend to get. And so that's why he likes this return to nature, return to innocence. They really like the idea of these more indigenous groups. The indigenous roots of Europe at this point have mostly been so diluted that they're not really connected with it. Like the Celts have been conquered by the Romans for a couple thousand years at this point. So, and the Celts would be the indigenous tribes for most of Western Europe. And then, yeah, so Diderot helped compile that first encyclopedia. Kind of this traditional non-scientific beliefs and superstitions were kind of the mainstay, and actually Diderot was imprisoned because he goes against that. But modern science is going to emerge based off empiricism. So, okay. Another good catalyst for this is for neoclassicism is Pompeii. So this is Pompeii with a Mount Vesuvius that erupted and covered it in the year 79. But this was rediscovered in 1738, so a little before the neoclassical period. So workers were laying foundations for a residence for the king of Naples. This is near Naples or Napoli in Italy, and so we also get excavations on the ruins of Herculaneum, which is the same year, and Herculaneum is like a little smaller town right next to Pompeii that was also covered. So it kind of helps spark that interest in classical antiquity. Again, Mount Vesuvius actually, we know it erupted August 24th in the year 79, during the early days of the Roman Empire. So the city wasn't actually covered with lava, it was covered with a pyroclastic flow, so it's just like gas and ash. It's about 300 degrees Celsius, so everyone just died instantly. They pretty much dropped where they were. They're pretty famous. Their corpses and whatnot, the holes that had left where their bodies had rotted away eventually were filled with plaster, and that's why we get those famous figures. We do know the flow was hotter at Herculaneum because lots of the figures, lots of their heads were just blown off because of it. But yeah, and then the ash covered it, bodies decomposed, made those cavities, so the plaster casts were filled, and that we got that thanks to the archaeologists who did that. Okay. And Johann Joachim Winckelmann, so he wrote the History of Greek Art. It's considered the first art history book. You can consider Vasari as like the first kind of modern art historian because well, perhaps not modern art historian. He's the first art historian, really, because we don't really get anyone that talks about it. Now, he doesn't really do it in a very art historical way. It's mostly biographical in a way, but also not super accurate biography. So this is the first like true art history book, the history of Greek art. So there's always been an interest in Greek art. So you can imagine it's pretty dominant in the realm of art history. Very, very dominant, actually. It's kind of hard to not have everything associated with it. But yeah, he praised Greek art for the noble simplicity and calm grandeur. Specifically Greek art, but just ancient art generally. We have the portrait of him. And then, again, if you remember from Rococo art, this grand tour, this kind of young aristocrats, it was a culmination, as they saw, for their classical education, so they would go visit the places of the classical sites and whatnot. And it became fashionable, especially for Northern European aristocrats. They visit Paris, Venice, Florence, and it's certainly Rome. Kind of gave concrete form to Northern Europeans' ideas about the Greco-Roman world and helped foster those neoclassical ideals. The most ambitious tourists, which you're not allowed to do today, visited excavations at sites like Pompeii, Herculaneum, Tivoli, and would even like purchase the antiquities that were found there, and they just bring them home. But you can recognize lots of this stuff here. So there's the Pantheon. There's lots of the triumphal arches, a couple of them. Here's Hercules over here on the left. Here's the dying Gaul. So Laocoon and his sons right here. So Colosseum. There's there's the Pantheon again. But there's the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius right there. So yeah, pretty cool. the Greco-Roman ideologies, especially during this period, they've already been very influential in Rome. I mean, in Europe, they're going to become solidified during this era. Everyone wants to be like Rome, even if you're German. Just think of the Russians want to be like Rome. The Tsar, the title of Russian royalty, Tsar is based off Caesar. The Caesar, just like the Kaiser in Germany. The Kaiser is based off of the Roman Caesar, which in Latin is Kaiser, actually. But yeah, and these thoughts are going to be hammered home, essentially, to the detriment or not. That's up to you. But very influential, and it's very much the world you are inheriting. The world we live in the West, is very Greco-Roman because of this, because all the Western European nations are going to take it as their own. So, okay, but here is the Apollo Belvedere. So it's just a Roman statue, this copy of a Greek statue, which is pretty typical if you remember from Art 201. So, and here's a quote. Once upon a time, there were some Greeks who made really good art. Then along came the Romans. They said, let's copy the art of the Greeks, which is, yeah, pretty much what happened. And then about 1,000 years later, the artists of the Renaissance said, let's revive Greek and Roman art, and let's make our art even better than the art back then, which is the idea. And they mostly do that by making it Christian subjects. As you can see here, we got David, a biblical figure. And then, a century later, an artist named Nicolas Poussin felt that the art of his time was becoming too frivolous, so he said Baroque painting should be serious like classical art. So he started Baroque classicism. Remember that from the Baroque era. And then, in another 100 years, some people again yearned for the dignity and heroicism of classical art. They said, we like the art of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We like the art of the Renaissance. We like the art of Poussin. Let's make more classical art. They called it Neoclassicism. So, classicism, but neo just means new. So new classical stuff. This is that period, and here's the neoclassical art. This is Antonio Canova, Perseus with the head of Medusa. Mythological story. So again, we're just copying the classical stuff. And this Roman classical stuff is always going to stay around. We will always have this. These are periods like with the Poussin and whatnot. I'm sorry, excuse me. That people are more concerned with it. So it's definitely the dominant ideology. One of the biggest critiques of this and the reaction to this will be Romanticism is it's not very authentic. People can't live by logic and pure reason alone, and that there's much more to life. And the age of the Enlightenment doesn't really get us anywhere. We get a lot of pretty horrific wars, so nothing really changes in that regard. But yeah. Here's some influence Greek and Roman art. It continues on today, like I've said. It's everywhere. It's pretty obvious. We don't really notice it. I mean, it's so much in our face and it's in our everyday lives. We do not notice it, but it's there everywhere. But yeah, I'm not gonna do that. But here are some good characteristics of their art before we dive into it more so. Planarity. It's mostly going to be on a plane up in front with us. We're not going to look at so much background stuff. But we're going to get this linearity as well. You know, it's still going to be accurate. It's good, but it's going to be calm. More serious, moralistic subjects. Austerity, more austere. So, hope you guys know what austerity means. But essentially, more serious, as it says there, but more. Yeah, it kind of goes with these. More moralizing subjects, more mythological stories, something that should provide learning, provide knowledge. So, but they're usually they're not like austere even though you can get a moralistic subject from something like, you know, Zeus and all his rapes and whatnot. It's not an austere subject. That's kind of you know how that is. So yeah, austere would be the opposite of that. Lots of classical figures, dress, themes. Sculptural forms, definitely, but even lighting, not just stark lighting, but very tight brushwork. We're not really going to see much loose brushwork at all. So, okay, there's that one. Okay, and we got a female artist here, Angelica Kaufman. So this is Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures. It's kind of an interesting story. This is actually in Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. But Kaufman herself, she was born in Switzerland. She studied in Rome, like most, and then she moved to London in 1766. So She was good friends with Joshua Reynolds, who's actually the first president of the Royal Academy. You don't really need to know him too much, but Royal Academy founded in 1768, so founded just a couple years after there. And she was actually a founding member of the Royal Academy in England, in London. So, and one of only two women that actually were ever admitted into the academy before the 20th century. So they let her and this one other lady in, but that's it pretty much. So we're in the 18th century, and then we're gonna get a whole like 150 years or so before another woman's allowed in. I'm not sure why necessarily, but and she actually, despite being one of two females, she is the only female history painter of the 18th century. And this is a historical painting. This is from Roman history. She wasn't really content painting portraits or still lifes, so most women didn't have the opportunity to do anything else, but she did. So this story is just a visiting friend is showing off her jewelry to Cornelia Gracchus and asks to see her jewels, and Cornelia points to her children and says, "These are my jewels." So, and her sons became the Gracchi, who are really famous Roman Republican politicians. So you can see her face, kind of like, really, we're gonna do this? But yeah, that's the story essentially. So Cornelia is pretty famous as a figure for motherhood, but also one of the most powerful women in the history of the Roman Republic. So kind of a model for Kaufman, but it's a pretty popular subject. We get this new interest in the importance of the family unit, which I cannot disparage. It's pretty important stuff. But then the Enlightenment teachings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau advocated that parents should nurture their children at home rather than sending them off to wet nurses and nannies until they were adolescents, which is pretty common. It's actually kind of sad to think about, especially for the upper classes. I don't know if you guys know what a wet nurse is, but a wet nurse is essentially the nurse that breastfeeds your baby for you. Yeah, lots of mothers didn't even breastfeed their own kids and stuff. So, and your kids practically don't know you. But with these I'm sorry, my daughter is upset. But you got these neoclassical elements, but the planarity is very shallow space, the linearity, but it's definitely, it's softer than David, who we'll look at as well. But we get definitely tight brushwork, even lighting, sculptural forms. So we have the classical figures and themes, even in their dress, and then moralistic, virtuous subject. So, but it's very austere, not anything weird happening, and it's also pretty bare. Like it's not flamboyant or anything. We have bare floors and walls, but pretty delicate version of Neoclassicism. So it's a pretty good painting. I really like Kaufman. So, but lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. It's good scripture. Sorry, Heather. Okay. But here is Johann Zoffany. So this is the academicians of the Royal Academy. So founding members of the British Royal Academy are the ones presented. And Sir Joshua Reynolds, the founding president, in the back. He's kind of just left of center here in wearing black. Zoffany, the artist, is on the very left here with his palette and brush. And we actually have two nude dudes here, the two male models. So I did say that Angelica Kaufman and one other woman, her name is actually Mary Moser, they were two founding female members. Where are they? So if you remember, they weren't allowed to be here because of the nude models, so they're here. They're in the portraits. That's how we included them, which I guess at least they were included, right? But Kaufman herself was actually kind of largely responsible for popularizing Neoclassicism in England. And Moser's reputation at the time rivaled Kaufman's. So, but women were barred from the study of the nude model, which pretty much formed the basis for academic training and representation from the 16th to the 19th century. So. And so they've kind of become objects of art rather than its producers, which is, a little ironic. But like the plaster casts and the relief sculptures, they are the objects of contemplation and inspiration for the male artists. But shows in a nutshell essentially just difficulties the women have had throughout the ages in a male-dominated art world. Nothing to do with their intelligence or skill or anything, but just, I feel like in some regards it's the opposite. Not necessarily that males have an opposite, but from my experience, most art students these days are women, so they certainly aren't barred from it. But yeah, so it's definitely got more of a doors aren't shut for women, because it's easy to have a very male dominated art world for most of history when the women pretty much aren't allowed to participate. So a bit unfortunate. Okay, so Benjamin West, this is the death of General Wolfe. The idea is that history paintings pretty much, they should be historically accurate, right? And so should contemporary history paintings. So this he's a British painter. He was actually an American, raised in the colonies. He was raised outside of Philadelphia, which very unfortunate to have to live near Philadelphia. But he went to Rome in 1760, and he studied with Mings, who did that initial portrait of Winckelmann we saw. Gavin Hamilton, he studied ancient art, and Raphael especially was the popular guy. Da Vinci's kind of taken hold of that for a while now, but he did eventually settle in London in 63, and he was one of the founding members of the Royal Academy in 68, and he was the second president when Joshua Reynolds died. But he kind of became a mentor for the American artists, and he was pretty proud of his New World heritage, and he actually supported the American Revolution. This here is a depiction from the French and Indian War in Quebec, in Canada. So it's not really classical. It's definitely not classical in subject, but not really in costume either, but in spirit. So General Wolfe was a British national hero. It is at the moment he sacrificed his life for his country. So we get the contemporary costume and sitting in Quebec, although not really historically correct. So he's posed like an image of Christ from the deposition from the cross, really. So we get the shift of emotions from religion to nationalism, which nationalism is looked pretty heavily down upon these days. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but it can be a little ludicrous sometimes. But we get the forces of nature kind of reinforce the emotional intensity. You can see the storm all on this right side that's rolling in. Kind of the smoke from the muskets blends in with the clouds and stuff. But the public actually really loved this. So they're witnessing, it's like a historical painting, but it's for current events. This has happened only 7 years before being painted, and this is before photography and film. So yeah. And we put the American Indian here, because again, with the idea of Rousseau, the noble savage, we like them. We think they're cool at this point. So I think this is Warhammer. I'm not exactly sure, if I'm being honest. I don't know who this is. But yeah, he's dying, I think. Okay. Jean-Baptiste Greuze. So it's the village bride or the marriage. So the moment when a father gives his son-in-law a dowry. So this is French. It's French genre painting. So this is kind of a sensation at the Paris Salon. So this is pretty common during this period. We like this more noble ideas, right? And again, the Salon is just that exhibitions for members of the Royal Academy, and they held it in the Louvre. And so it would be packed with paintings. It would be attended by thousands of people from all classes of society. So it's kind of the beginning for serious art critics, which I don't know if we take most of those art critics very seriously anymore. But yeah, very neoclassical in the sense it's very virtuous. Idea of family life. The house is neat, even though it is modest. So you're supposed to get the idea that they're hardworking and religious, even though they're a lower class. So just like Rousseau, not even the noble savage, but the poor people, they're full of natural virtue, this honest sentiment, which in many regards I don't think he's wrong. But yeah, perhaps the social media has been blurring that line a bit. But it kind of corresponds with those ideals of Rousseau. The naive poor, as he called it, are closer to nature and are thus more virtuous and moral than the more cultivated aristocracy. So, but the lots of gestures and emotions. People thought they seemed pretty authentic. So definitely compared to Poussin, right? So Poussin kind of starts that Baroque classicism. I think Greuze does a better job here. Seems a bit more authentic feeling than Poussin in many regards. So he's receiving the dowry. You know, when you got married, before you get the dowry for the daughter, so the girl would come with a dowry. So the guy who's marrying her gets money for marrying her from the father. It seems to be a pretty modest amount, but there it is in his hand. So. And there's the village bride. Jealous sisters, happy couple, the giving father, the solemn mother, and barnyard animals. With barnyard animals. Yeah, it's pretty good. I think it's funny. Okay. There's another one. Just going to look at some sculpture. This is Jean-Antoine Houdon, Voltaire seated. So Voltaire is a pretty popular philosopher for this period. He wrote Candide. That's probably his most famous work, Candide. But all part of this doctrine of progress. So again, that progress through science and knowledge, it's good. So the spirit of empiricism, he's liked to study nature. And then Houdon himself, liked to study nature, but he specialized in portraiture and depicted major thinkers of the Enlightenment, including Diderot, Rousseau, Louis XVI, Catherine II, or Catherine the Great of Russia, and even Benjamin Franklin. So here is he kind of is known for capturing the look and the character of his sitters. He's pretty famous. I mean, perhaps his name isn't as well known, but he's got some really some pretty good works, to be honest. And this is actually just a terracotta cast from the original plaster. There's one in LACMA again in LA, but we like the empiricism. So we see the sagging skin on the neck, the sunken mouth because he's toothless, the slumping shoulders. So we're being authentic to the senses, what we see. But the character is supposed to show his sharp intellect and wit, and even though weak in body, we're still lively in spirit. But yeah, and then it's been pretty classicized. He is wearing a Roman toga and a Roman headband, and he's even sitting in like an antique style chair. And here's his bust of Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He kind of looks like Brother Merrill in the humanities and philosophy department. He's like one of the main philosophy professors. If you've seen him, hopefully you agree with me, because I think I'm right. Yeah. Does anyone know who this is? It's at the LA County Museum, LACMA. That's George Washington. So I did a bust of him. This guy too, Benjamin Franklin. It's pretty cool. I think so. And here's another student did. Okay. So Jacques-Louis David, he's probably he's probably the most well-known neoclassical painter. David. And he's French. This is the Oath of the Horatii. Some people call it the Horatii. I think it's the Horatii, to be honest. But yeah, he's a student of Boucher. He's the Rococo painter, and his father was actually killed in a duel, and he was raised by uncles who are architects, and they wanted him to be an architect, but he ended up not doing that pretty much. So he was pretty disillusioned by the French court, but he wanted to paint noble, uplifting, moral scenes, and he also just wanted his paintings to be clear, precise, easy to read. So this one's 13 feet squared in the Louvre, and he painted this while he was in Rome. So he came in contact with Mings, Winckelmann, Hamilton. All those guys admired their work. His work became an immediate sensation. So the story itself is not a super well-known one, but it's a Roman story. There was a border dispute between Rome and neighboring Alba, which is an ancient kingdom on the Italian peninsula. Alba is also the Gaelic name for Scotland, so in Scottish Gaelic that's what they call it, but not to be confused with that. The Horatii sister was engaged to one of the Curiati brothers, so you can see them upset over here. And even a Horatii brother was married to a Curiati sister. And so the Horatii, led by the father, take a vow to fight to the death for their country. So essentially, to end the conflict, the border dispute, they're going to send 3 Curiati versus 3 Horatii, and when all three, one dies, then the other side wins. That's essentially the story. And the Horatii win. Only one of them survives, but they win. So, but we do get this it's very neoclassical in the sense that this composition is pretty simple, but it's striking. We had a lot of hard lines, this austere space, stark columns, just these simple Tuscan columns. This very firm stance contrasted with the mourning women. So this noble and virtuous action, like country above your personal feelings, even for family. What's perhaps the worst part of the story is the brother, when he gets back to the city, his sister sees that it's him and not the man she's engaged to, and she cries, and the brother kills her. And he is put on trial, and he's found innocent because the idea is there should be no tears for the enemy. So That's the idea, which is still quite messed up. But yeah. But that's the full classical story. It doesn't really talk about that here, of course. But yeah, we got a lot of sharp lines, tight brushwork, sculptural forms, very classical figures, kind of sculpturally rendered, and themes. So, but definitely a moralistic subject. We get the strong men, the weak women. It's a common depiction at the time. So, the lighting is kind of harsh, casts pretty precise shadows. So we are still influenced by like Caravaggio and stuff like that. But the setting and the costumes are pretty carefully researched and put out there. But so we're integrating the message with this style. So it's kind of just quintessential neoclassical picture right here. Kind of to get this. There's the horror of impending violence, a bloodbath, which is something like Romanticism would focus on, but we're not really focused on it. So, but this is pretty influential art at the start of the French Revolution. Although David himself wasn't a revolutionary at the time he painted it, you got to be willing to die for country, stuff like this noble stuff right here. So here's the detail. Very good. Very talented, a lot of detail with that tight brushwork. So but you can see how his work's a bit different than his tutors. Usually it's a bit more obvious in many regards, but okay. But subject of the work on the left is derived from A, Roman history. 2, the artist of the work on the left was a leading representative of B, Neoclassicism. And then the work on the right is an example of well, you just generally A. You could pretty much say D is fine as well. But A, genre painting. So, and then both works illustrate the reaction against. It's a reaction against the Rococo, but also a reaction, well, pretty much just in response to the revival of interest in antiquity. And then the work on the right is associated with the growing interest in sentimentality and rustic virtue. See? Not women's liberation. Nope, not get there yet. But both works do which of the following? You guys see it? It's probably, so I would say B. Combine emotional narrative and didactic content. So there's perhaps, yeah, we're putting emotional stuff, perhaps more obviously on the right one, but we're putting emotional stuff on either end, but there's still business being done, the didactic content, going off to battle, just accepting the dowry, stuff like that. Okay. And then which of the following is true of the work on the left? It's not D, it's not C, it's not B, so it's A. It was intended as a moral example. Hope that's all pretty straightforward. Okay. Well, this is an interesting writing topic. I'll have you guys do it. So in David's Oath of the Herati, 3 brothers take an oath to fight for their country, to their death if necessary. So as seen through the lens of the French revolutionaries, the Herati brothers provide an example of an intense patriotism, a willingness to fight and die for the principles of liberty, freedom, and equality. So, what do you think? Are some ideas worth dying for, and if so, which ones? And better yet, if you have a painting in mind that might reinforce those ideas, feel free to write the name down in the artist so I can look it up. Okay, you can pause this if you need to write this down. Just take a couple minutes, whatever. It doesn't need to be too long. But email it to me. Sorry, of course. But we're gonna go on. Okay, but more David. So this is the death of Marat. Death of Marat. So by about 1791, he became pretty active in the cause of the French Revolution, which began in 1789. But he was actually kind of a painter for the revolution and for the new regime afterwards. And this is his most famous portrait of the period. So this was a leader of the revolution and a close friend of David. And Marat was a dedicated revolutionary, known to be ruthless, Well, not necessarily. Yeah, I guess ruthless. I guess they're revolutionary. That's probably fair enough. But another ruthless person, a counter-revolutionary. Her name was Charlotte Corday. She actually brought him a fake petition and plunged a knife into his chest while he was reading it. Um, so this is actually, we see him in his bathtub. This is his portable desk laid across his bathtub, where he spent most of his time because he had a lethal skin condition. Um, so he spent most of the time in his bath. But this is pretty stark, kind of like Zerberon's. We get with the pretty blank background, but just the main focus figure on it. But we have the desk across the tub, and then portable desk. But definitely attention to detail, sharp lighting. Not really accurate though. His bathroom was actually quite lavish, and Marat was unattractive in life. It didn't help that he was also, had a pretty rough skin condition, which we don't really see here. And then the writing crate itself is kind of represented like a tombstone. And so Marat is also like posed here, kind of like a Christ figure. So, but we definitely have a sense of planarity. It's up front, it's in our face. Pretty horrific though. And then personal intensity, kind of signature, but it's almost romantic in that regard. But also the idealization, it's not accurate. His bathroom was quite lavish, and again, Marat was unattractive in life. So this is kind of being used as propaganda in many regards. But yeah. But we also get that interface bloody knife, this heroic martyr, which is kind of typical for Baroque art too, to be honest. But the knife's down here. And here's the Zerberon, Saint Serapion, if you remember that one. Okay. More questions. The work on the right was painted by D. Benjamin West. Both paintings date from the period, so for Neoclassicism's prime, 1751 to 1800 C. Both paintings show an event from the artist's own times as contemporary events. Both artists assume the viewer's familiarity with earlier depictions of the deposition of Christ, so Christ taken down from the cross. Both of them are presented that way. Figures in the painting on the right wear contemporary dress. They're just how they would be for the time. And then both paintings reflect which of the following general trends in the history of their period. Growing sense of nationalism, especially when you these are both from wars, right? So if your country's involved in a war, nationalistic sentiments might be more common because that's what helps push you to support wars, which are generally unpleasant, right? So growing sense of nationalism, especially here where someone's dying on the home front. This one might be a little bit more of a stretch, right, with that nationalistic pull, because this is just the French and Indian War over in Quebec and Canada and whatnot in the States, and this, this would be for people back home in England. But yeah, well, this one's for a revolution happening in the country. So okay, I'm not gonna read that all to you, but you guys can pause and read that if you like. Here's a dead cat, very sad. Okay. Another famous artist for this period, and another female artist actually, is Marie-Louise Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. Quite the long name. Vigée-Lebrun is what she's often known as. Is a portrait of Marie Antoinette, the one who gets her head cut off later. She's very famous celebrity at the point. Vigée-Lebrun was her portraitist, pretty much. So. Right here she is with a self-portrait with her daughter. So, quite a bit different than the portrait she gets for the queen. But this is definitely showing that impact of David's neoclassicism, right? So she was actually self-taught because she was denied access into the Royal Academy, and she began painting portraits when she was a teenager, which is actually illegal. You weren't allowed to paint someone's portrait if you didn't have a license, which you had to get from the Academy. But she did marry a painter, and he was a painter and an art dealer. So it kind of gave her powerful contacts, and she became the favorite portraitist of Queen Marie Antoinette. And so because of the Queen's influence, she was actually accepted into the Royal Academy in 1783. And then this reflects that taste for the classical. So she's wearing a toga. This is not contemporary dress. Toga, we got the Roman-style hairdo and headband. Very austere, just blank wall. So life has begun to imitate art in many regards. but also shows the ideal of Rousseau, the greater parental involvement in child rearing. So we start to see young children showing up in portraiture more with their parents. We still have some Rococo influence, the soft contours, curvilinear patterns. This is very Rococo work from the other one we saw. So. And there's Sister Duque with her daughter. Looking at it. I forgot that one was still in here. But cute. Is that another student, dude? Okay. How many of you knew Thomas Jefferson was actually an architect as well? Well, here he is. He was an amateur architect. And he designed this. This is his home in Monticello. Well, Monticello, someplace. There's a lot of towns with this name throughout the United States. Often they're called Monticello, but Monticello. Yeah, so Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, it's probably the biggest thing he may have done. And well, he was also the third president of the United States, so that's a pretty big deal too, I guess. Back when presidents were cool. But yeah, this is in a government class. Okay, but we get this very much classical revival style. This takes off in the country, right? They look at all our government buildings, right? And then, but why again? So the new republic that was founded, modeled after the democracy of in Athens, and more so is modeled after the Republic of Rome, and even in many regards, the diarchy of Sparta. But, you know, look at the White House, Capitol building. Lots of our churches, our banks, government buildings. So, yeah. But Thomas Jefferson was an amateur architect, and he designed this. So, but speaking of government building, here's the White House. Very classical. Here's the U.S. Capitol building. Incredibly classical. Most state capitol buildings are modeled after this building. Some more than others, different material. The Colorado one, it uses like this dark limestone. There's this like pink granite on the Texas State Capitol one. The Texas State Capitol, I think, is the biggest of all the state capitals. I think it's still smaller than the national one, although it's taller than the national one. I know that. But Idaho's, Utah's, most of them follow the same format. Not all of them. Connecticut's is actually quite pretty, and it's a little bit different. And then New York's doesn't have a dome like this. It's pretty old too. And then you get abominations like Louisiana's that has like a sky, like it looks like this at the base, but then they have like a skyscraper in the middle. You guys can go look that up. It's pretty interesting. But yeah. Okay, we're gonna do a little bit of unknowns. So just get your bank down and then go through which artists. Okay, we got Kaufman. We're gonna look at West, and then Greuze, Houdon. They're both Jean-Baptiste, Jean-Antoine, and then all the French people get multiple names. Interesting. David and Vigée Lebrun. Okay. This one. This is called The Death of Socrates. If you guys don't know, Socrates was actually sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. And either exile or death. And he was like, I'm not going to exile, so you just have to leave your city and never come back, pretty much. But he did the death, and so he's drinking hemlock, which is a herb. It gets ground up into a drink and whatnot, and it kills you. You just lose in the story where he talks about him dying, Plato wrote about it. It's you start to lose feeling in your arms and legs and stuff like that, and it just like works its way up to your chest, and then once it hits your heart, you're dead. But this is Jacques-Louis David. Depiction of that, the Death of Socrates. Pretty heroic, pretty austere, very neoclassical. This is not her patron. This is Madame Perregaux. But this is Vigée Lebrun. See, it looks a lot like her work. So, and there's her. This one, a bit different. In the scene, the home scene. It's called Broken Eggs. A little kid over here. This is Greuze, Jean-Baptiste Greuze. The sculptor, Jean-Antoine Houdon, our sculptor. There's actually a bust of Thomas Jefferson, so there's Thomas Jefferson. American icon. So our other female artists, this is Angelica Kaufman. It's a self-portrait, hesitating between painting and music. So she actually, when she was younger, it's just her when she's younger, she was like, she didn't know if she wanted to study painting or music for her as a living, and she ended up going. She's looking back at music right now. They're locking eyes, but she ends up going with painting, though. The self-portrait. Okay, and then the last one, we get Benjamin West. So this is the Treaty of Penn, named after William Penn, which is the state of Pennsylvania is named after. Sylvania is kind of what do they call this? For some reason I'm drawing a blank. But you just add it to a word for like forest, essentially is what it means. So Pennsylvania, with Indians. Treaty of Penn with Indians is what it says. I don't know what tribe this is actually. Might be a couple tribes represented here, but I don't know. You see this though? She's breastfeeding the baby, but the baby is like just tied down, which is sure convenient. I don't know, it just feels like a little weird just tying your baby down so you can not have him wiggle around so much. But here are the works to know. Okay. We get Kaufman, the West, Grew, Swedon, two Davids, the Vichy Lebrun, and Tommy Jefferson's Monticello. So know those. Your exam on this will be Rococo art, Neoclassicism, and Romanticism. All three of those will be. So we're not done with the unit yet. We still gotta go over Romanticism, which I should be back in on campus for. But yeah. If you have any questions, please, of course, feel free to email me. And of course, email me the one writing prompt that I put there for my students. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time.